Hey folks, before the video starts, please leave a like and subscribe to cheer me up. Make sure you are relaxed and enjoy today's stories. I played the Jeffrey Dahmer game on the dark web. I ended up on a dark web Netflix series. Alright, so this is going to sound insane, but I need to get this off my chest. I've been going down some pretty dark rabbit holes on the internet lately, trying to find the weirdest stuff out there. You know, for the thrill of it. Yeah, I know, it's stupid, but you get hooked. It started with just browsing creepy forums and ended with me diving into the dark web. A couple of weeks ago, I came across this forum thread that talked about a game called the Jeffrey Dahmer experience. The name alone should have been a red flag, but curiosity got the better of me. The thread was full of people claiming it was the most realistic horror game ever made, and some said it was an interactive documentary about Dahmer's life. Sick, I know, but they also mentioned something about real life consequences, which I thought was just part of the game's creepy allure. To access it, you had to go through a maze of Tor links and encrypted messages. The whole process took about 2 hours, but I finally reached a page that looked like some kind of 90s hacker's paradise green text on a black background with a pixelated skull at the top. The download link was at the bottom, just sitting there, daring me to click it. Against my better judgment, I did. The download was surprisingly quick. When I opened the file, there was just one executable, Dahmer.exe. I took a deep breath and double-clicked it. The screen went black for a few seconds before the game loaded. The main menu was just a dark, grainy image of an apartment door with ominous music playing in the background. The only option was to start the game, so I clicked it. The game started in a dimly lit apartment that looked way too realistic. The attention to detail was unnerving. I could hear muffled screams and the faint sound of a drill. The game instructed me to explore the apartment and look for clues about Dahmer's life. As I moved through the rooms, I found disturbing items. A stained mattress, a collection of Polaroid photos showing mutilated bodies, and jars containing what looked like human organs. Things took a turn for the worse when I found a hidden door behind a bookshelf. It led to a small dark room with a single chair in the middle. The game instructed me to sit in the chair. I hesitated, but eventually did as I was told. Suddenly, I felt a sharp pain in my wrist. I looked down and saw a needle sticking out of it, and everything went black. When I woke up, I was still in my room, but something felt off. My computer screen was showing a live feed of me, sitting at my desk, and there was a chat window open. Messages started pouring in from anonymous users, commenting on my every move. Panic set in as I realized that my webcam had been hacked and I was being watched. Then a new message appeared. Welcome to the show. I tried to shut down my computer, but it wouldn't respond. More messages popped up, instructing me to follow specific commands or face consequences. They started off small, like cutting my arm with a knife or destroying my favorite belongings. Every time I hesitated, they would somehow show me live footage of my family or friends, implying they could hurt them if I didn't comply. Things escalated quickly. They made me do unspeakable things to myself and sent proof in the form of pictures and videos to my phone. I was too scared to call the police. Who would believe me? And even if they did, these people seemed capable of doing anything. One night, they instructed me to go to a specific location in the city. Desperate and terrified, I went. It was a dingy, abandoned warehouse, Inside, I found a camera setup and a chair, similar to the one in the game. I was told to sit and wait. Minutes felt like hours, and then a man in a mask entered the room. He didn't say a word. Instead, he handed me a box cutter and pointed to my arm. The chat window on my phone exploded with messages urging me to do it. I made a shallow cut, hoping it would be enough, but the masked man shook his head. He pointed again, this time to my thigh. With trembling hands, I made a deeper cut. The pain was excruciating, but I didn't stop until the man nodded in approval. He then handed me a small USB drive and left without a word. Back home, I plugged the USB into my computer. There was a single video file on it. It was a montage of all the horrible things I'd been forced to do, edited together like some twisted episode of a reality show. The title at the end made my blood run cold. Jeffrey Dahmer, the dark web series, episode 1. I've been too scared to leave my house since then. I keep getting messages from anonymous users, taunting me, threatening me, and sometimes just watching me. I don't know who they are or how to make them stop. They've ruined my life, and I feel like I'm living in a nightmare. If anyone knows how to get out of this, please help. I don't know how much longer I can take this. I didn't sleep for days. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the masked man, the blood, and that sickening title card flashing in my mind. My phone kept pinging with notifications, each one dragging me further into this nightmare. I became paranoid, constantly checking my surroundings, convinced I was being watched. Then the next set of instructions came. They were in the form of a video this time. It was me, sitting at my desk, but the background was different. It was my bedroom, but the walls were covered in grotesque, explicit images I'd never seen before. Pictures of mutilated bodies, my own face photoshopped onto some of them. The voice on the video was distorted, but the message was clear. Continue the game, or everyone you love will suffer. I thought about going to the police, but the fear of those threats made me hesitate. They knew everything about me, where I lived, my friends, my family. It was clear these people were serious. I couldn't risk their safety. The next task was delivered through a video link. It showed a live feed of a dark, dingy basement. There was a table in the center with various tools laid out neatly. On the floor, there was a man, bound and gagged, struggling against his restraints. A message appeared on the screen. You have 1 hour to finish the job, or we'll finish it for you. Instructions are in the toolbox. I drove to the address provided, my hands shaking the entire way. The basement was exactly as it had been in the video. The man on the floor looked at me with pleading eyes, and I felt my stomach turn. The toolbox was filled with surgical instruments, knives, and other horrifying tools. I opened the envelope on top, my heart pounding in my chest. The instructions were clear. I had to make precise cuts and inflict specific injuries, all while keeping the man alive. The camera in the corner of the room whirred to life, and I knew they were watching. The man started screaming through his gag as I approached him with the first tool. I wanted to stop, to run, but the thought of what these people could do to my loved ones kept me going. Every cut, every scream echoed in my head long after I left that basement. I couldn't believe what I had done. I spent hours in the shower, scrubbing at my skin, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't wash away the guilt, the horror. I received another USB drive in the mail the next day. It was another episode of their twisted series. This time, It featured the footage from the basement, expertly edited with dramatic music and commentary from distorted voices. They praised my performance, and the episode ended with a cliffhanger, teasing more to come. I was in too deep now. The messages became more frequent, more demanding. They made me do things that left me questioning my sanity. I was sent to other locations, each more horrifying than the last. An abandoned hospital where I had to navigate through hallways filled with decrepit mannequins, their glassy eyes following me. A secluded cabin in the woods where I was forced to dig shallow graves in the middle of the night. Every task was recorded, edited, and sent back to me as another episode. My life outside the game deteriorated. I stopped going to work, cut off contact with friends and family. I was always on edge, jumping at the slightest sound. My apartment became a prison, the walls closing in on me. The constant fear and paranoia made it impossible to function. The worst part was the constant surveillance. I found hidden cameras in my home, tiny devices embedded in everyday objects. No matter how many I found and destroyed, there were always more. I could never be sure I was alone. The feeling of being watched, judged, and controlled was suffocating. I tried to find a way out, searching the dark web for any information on the people behind this. But every lead led to a dead end. Every forum thread ended in deleted accounts and warnings to stop digging. It was as if these people were ghosts, leaving no trace behind. One night, as I sat in my darkened apartment, staring blankly at the latest episode, I received a message that chilled me to the bone. Your season finale is coming. Prepare yourself. The screen flickered, and for a brief moment, I saw my own reflection, pale and hollow-eyed, staring back at me. I don't know what they have planned for the finale, but I can feel it looming over me like a storm. I've been pushed to my limits, forced to do things I never thought possible. If anyone out there is listening, if you're considering diving into the dark web for thrills, take my story as a warning. Once you're in, there's no way out. The next message came with a live feed of my parents' house. I watched in horror as masked figures moved through their home, placing cameras and setting up what looked like a makeshift studio. The message was simple. It's time for the grand finale. Bring your family. I have to go now. I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm terrified. If I don't make it out of this, let this be a warning. The dark web is no place for games, and some doors, once opened, can never be closed. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. All I could think about was that final message. They wanted my family involved now, and I knew I had no choice. The thought of putting my parents through this was unbearable, but the alternative was worse. I couldn't let those masked figures hurt them. I drove to my parents' house in the dead of night, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. How was I going to explain this to them? What could I possibly say to make them understand the danger we were in? As I pulled up to the house, I noticed the telltale glint of hidden cameras in the yard. They were already watching. I took a deep breath and knocked on the door. My mom answered, her face lighting up when she saw me, but her expression quickly changed to one of concern. I must have looked terrible, pale, gaunt, and haunted. I didn't waste any time. Mom, Dad, we need to talk, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. We sat in the living room, and I told them everything, every horrifying detail, every terrible thing I had been forced to do. Their faces went from confused to horrified to terrified. My dad tried to stand up, to call the police, but I grabbed his arm. "They'll kill you. They'll kill all of us," I pleaded. As if on cue, my phone buzzed. A new message appeared. "Welcome home. Time for the family reunion." The TV flickered on, showing a live feed of us sitting in the living room. My mom gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. My dad's face turned white as a sheet. Then the next set of instructions came through. We were to follow specific orders or face immediate consequences. The first command was simple. We had to destroy all means of communication, phones, computers, anything that could call for help. My parents hesitated, but I didn't. I smashed my phone on the floor, and they reluctantly followed suit. The next command was to pack a bag with clothes and essentials. We were given an address and told to leave immediately. My mom was crying, and my dad was trying to stay strong, but I could see the fear in his eyes. We packed in silence, the weight of the situation pressing down on us. The address led us to an old, abandoned motel on the outskirts of town. The parking lot was empty, and the place looked like it hadn't been used in years. As we walked to the room number provided, my heart pounded in my chest. I opened the door, and there they were, the masked figures from the videos, standing in the dimly lit room, waiting for us. They didn't speak. They simply pointed to the bed, where more equipment was laid out, cameras, microphones, and what looked like a script. We were going to be part of their sick show, and they were going to film every moment of it. My parents looked at me, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and betrayal. I had brought this nightmare into their lives. The first task was the hardest. They made us sit in front of the camera and confess our deepest, darkest secrets, things we had never told anyone. My mom broke down, admitting to an affair she had years ago. My dad confessed to stealing money from his company. I could see the pain and shame in their eyes as they were forced to bare their souls to the anonymous audience. Then the tasks became physical. They made us harm each other, just enough to draw blood and tears. The masked figures watched in silence, their eyes cold and unfeeling behind their masks. Every scream, every cry was recorded, every moment captured for their twisted entertainment. Days passed in a blur of pain and fear. We were kept in that motel room, forced to perform for the cameras. We couldn't leave, couldn't escape. The masked figures brought us food and water, just enough to keep us alive. They didn't speak, didn't show any emotion. They were like shadows, always there, always watching. One night, as I lay on the floor, too exhausted to move, I heard my mom whispering to my dad. They were planning to make a run for it, to try and escape when the masked figures weren't looking. I wanted to believe it could work, but deep down, I knew it was hopeless. These people were always one step ahead. The next morning, my parents made their move. They waited until the masked figures were distracted, then bolted for the door. They didn't make it far. The masked figures were on them in an instant, dragging them back into the room. My dad fought back, and they beat him until he was unconscious. My mom was screaming, begging them to stop, but they didn't listen. After that, the tone of the show changed. It became more violent, more sadistic. They forced us to hurt each other in ways I can't even describe. My dad was barely conscious most of the time, his body covered in bruises and cuts. My mom was a wreck, her spirit broken. I tried to stay strong for them, but every day was a battle just to stay sane. Then came the announcement. The final episode was approaching. They had saved the worst for last. The masked figures gathered us in the center of the room and handed me a knife. The message was clear. One of us had to die, and it was my decision who it would be. I looked at my parents, my heart breaking. I couldn't do it. I couldn't choose, but the masked figures didn't give me a choice. They started a countdown, their distorted voices echoing in my ears. 10 seconds to decide, or they would kill all of us. In the end, I made the only choice I could. I turned the knife on myself. As the blade cut into my flesh, I felt a strange sense of relief. Maybe this nightmare would finally end. Maybe my parents would be spared. As I collapsed to the floor, the last thing I saw was the masked figures closing in, their cold eyes watching me bleed out. But I didn't die. I woke up in a hospital, my body weak and bandaged. My parents were there, their faces gaunt and haunted. They told me the masked figures had vanished after I passed out, leaving us behind. The police found us and brought us to safety, but the damage was done. Our lives were shattered, and the videos of our torment were still out there, circulating on the dark web. We've tried to move on, but the scars run deep. We live in constant fear, always looking over our shoulders, waiting for the day the masked figures return. The dark web is a place of nightmares, and once you're pulled in, there's no escape. If you're reading this, take my story as a warning. Don't go looking for the darkness. It will find you soon enough. Recovery was a cruel joke. The hospital's fluorescent lights felt like needles in my eyes, and the beeping of machines was a constant reminder that I was still alive. My parents sat by my bed, their faces a mix of relief and lingering fear. The nurses and doctors were kind, but they couldn't understand the depths of what we'd been through. They didn't know about the masked figures or the dark web series. To them, we were just another case of extreme trauma. The police questioned us relentlessly. They wanted details, anything that could help them track down the people responsible. But every time we tried to explain, it sounded like a twisted nightmare. How could we make them understand the terror of being watched, controlled, and tortured for a faceless audience? They took our statements, promised to investigate, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. They didn't believe us. Not really. We were sent to a safe house, a small, nondescript building in a quiet neighborhood. The windows were barred, and there were security cameras everywhere. It was meant to protect us, but it felt more like another prison. My parents tried to make the best of it, but we were all haunted by what had happened. My dad had nightmares every night, waking up in a cold sweat, screaming about the masked figures. My mom became distant, her eyes hollow and empty. One evening, as I sat staring at the TV without really watching, a familiar ping sounded from my laptop. My heart raced as I opened it, hoping it was just a glitch. But there it was, a new message from the same anonymous account. Miss us? Panic set in. I showed the message to my parents, and we contacted the police immediately. They took the laptop, assuring us they would trace the source. But deep down, I knew it was pointless. These people were ghosts, experts at covering their tracks. The police were dealing with something far beyond their understanding. The next day, I received a package at the safe house. No return address, just a plain brown box. Inside was a single USB drive and a note. Watch it alone. My hands shook as I plugged the drive into my laptop. The video was a recording of our time in the hospital, every intimate moment captured in horrifying detail. The masked figures had been watching us the entire time. The video ended with a message. The finale isn't over. We're always watching. I felt a cold dread settle in my bones. This wasn't just a game to them. It was an obsession. I knew then that we would never be safe, no matter where we went. Days turned into weeks, and the messages kept coming. Sometimes they were threats. Other times they were taunts. They sent pictures of us in the safe house, proof that they knew exactly where we were. My parents and I were living in constant fear, jumping at every sound, every shadow. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard a faint tapping on the window. My heart pounded as I got up to investigate. Outside, in the darkness, I saw a figure standing motionless, wearing one of those horrible masks. I screamed, and the figure disappeared into the night. The police arrived within minutes, but there was no trace of the intruder. The next morning, we found another USB drive on the doorstep. This one contained footage of the masked figure standing outside our window, watching us for hours. The message was clear. They could get to us any time they wanted. We decided to leave the safe house, to try and disappear completely. The police helped us change our identities, set us up with new lives in a different state. It felt like we were running from a monster that could never be escaped. The new house was nice enough, but the fear followed us. Every night, I checked the windows and doors multiple times, convinced they would find us again. Months went by without any incidents, and we started to relax, just a little. My dad got a new job, and my mom began to smile again. I even made a few friends, trying to build some semblance of a normal life. But the scars were still there, just beneath the surface. Then one day, I received a friend request on a new social media account. The profile picture was a familiar, grotesque mask. The message read, "You can't hide from us." I felt the world crash around me. They had found us again. The police couldn't help. They had done everything they could. I knew there was only one way to end this. I had to confront them, to face the darkness head on. I followed the instructions they sent, going to a remote location late at night. It was an old, abandoned factory, the perfect place for a final showdown. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. I could hear faint whispers, the sound of footsteps echoing through the empty halls. I followed the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. Finally, I entered a large room, and there they were, the masked figures, standing in a circle, waiting for me. The leader stepped forward, his mask more elaborate than the others. He handed me a camera and a knife, the implications clear. This was to be the true finale, the ultimate act of horror. They wanted me to choose, to kill, to sacrifice, to entertain their twisted audience one last time. I felt a surge of anger, of defiance. I raised the camera and the knife, but not in the way they expected. Instead, I turned the camera on them, recording their masks, their cold eyes. "This ends now," I said, my voice shaking but determined. I slashed at the nearest figure, the blade cutting through the mask, revealing a face underneath, a face that looked so normal, so human. The others lunged at me, but I fought back, the adrenaline giving me strength. The camera recorded everything, their faces, their screams, their panic. In the chaos, I managed to escape, the footage clutched tightly in my hand. I ran until I found a police station, handing over the camera, the evidence of the nightmare we had lived through. The authorities took it seriously this time, launching a massive investigation. They arrested several people, uncovering a network of dark web criminals who thrived on terror and pain. But even with the arrests, I knew the true masterminds were still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for their chance to strike again. We were given new identities once more, but the fear never left us. We live in constant vigilance, knowing that the darkness is always watching. This is my story, my warning. The dark web is a realm of horrors beyond imagination. It takes and takes until there's nothing left. If you value your sanity, your life, stay far, far away. The new town was small and quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos that had consumed our lives. My parents and I were living under new names, trying to piece together the fragments of our shattered existence. Despite the sense of calm that the new environment offered, the specter of our past hung over us like a dark cloud. I enrolled in a local community college, hoping that immersing myself in studies might offer some semblance of normalcy. I kept to myself, avoiding questions about my past. My parents found jobs that allowed them to stay under the radar. We were careful, always looking over our shoulders, always waiting for the other shoe to drop. One night, while studying in my room, I received an email from an unfamiliar address. My blood ran cold as I opened it. The subject line simply read, "Final cut." Attached was a video file. With trembling hands, I clicked on it. The video began with footage of the abandoned factory, the same place where I had confronted the masked figures. The camera panned around the room, showing the chaos and violence from that night. Then the scene changed. It was my new home, my parents' new jobs, my college campus. The message was clear. They knew where we were. They had found us again. I felt a wave of nausea and fear. How had they tracked us down? We had been so careful. The next day, I found another USB drive on the doorstep. This one contained a live feed of our living room, showing my parents sitting on the couch, unaware that they were being watched. A text overlay appeared on the screen. "The game isn't over." I knew we couldn't run again. This time, they were leaving no room for escape. They wanted to end it on their terms. Desperation clawed at my mind as I tried to think of a way out. I spent hours researching, diving deeper into the dark web, trying to find any information that could help us. In one of the darkest corners of the internet, I stumbled upon a forum thread discussing a group known as the Watchers. They were infamous for creating real-life horror experiences, broadcasting them to a select audience on the dark web. The stories were eerily similar to what we had gone through, each one ending in tragedy. But there was a glimmer of hope. A single post from someone claiming to have escaped their clutches. The post provided detailed instructions on how to dismantle their network, including names, locations, and encrypted files that could be used as evidence. It was a long shot, but it was all I had. I copied everything and prepared to confront the police again, armed with this new information. Before I could leave, I received another email. This time, it was a live feed from inside our house. The masked figures were there, silently watching my parents as they slept. The email included a single line, "Come alone, or they die." I knew I had no choice. I grabbed the USB drives, my laptop, and a small knife, then headed to the location they provided. It was another abandoned building on the outskirts of the town. As I entered, the smell of decay and the cold air sent shivers down my spine. The interior was dark, illuminated only by flickering fluorescent lights. I moved cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. Suddenly, I was grabbed from behind and dragged into a dimly lit room. The masked figures stood in a circle, their leader stepping forward, holding a camera. "Welcome to the finale," he said, his voice distorted. You've been an excellent player, but now it's time to end this." They forced me into a chair and tied me down. The camera was positioned to capture every moment. The leader handed me a piece of paper with another set of instructions. This time, it was a demand for a final confession, a full recounting of everything that had happened, every detail of the torment they had put us through. As I read the paper, a plan began to form in my mind. I knew I had to stall for time. I began to speak, my voice shaky but determined. I told them everything, from the first encounter with the game to the night in the factory. I made sure to include every horrifying detail, watching their reactions closely. While I spoke, I subtly worked on loosening the ropes binding my wrists. The figures were so engrossed in my story that they didn't notice my efforts. As I neared the end of my tale, I felt the ropes give way. With a sudden burst of strength, I freed myself and lunged at the leader, knocking the camera out of his hands. Chaos erupted. The other figures rushed to subdue me, but I fought back with everything I had. In the struggle, I managed to grab my knife and slashed at the nearest figure. They recoiled in pain, giving me a moment to dash towards the exit. I ran through the dark hallways, the masked figures hot on my trail. I burst out of the building and into the night, not stopping until I reached the police station. Bursting in, I handed over the USB drives and the encrypted files, shouting about the urgency of the situation. The police took me seriously this time. With the evidence in hand, they launched a raid on the abandoned building. They found the masked figures, arrested them, and dismantled their operation. The footage and the files provided enough proof to shut down their entire network. In the aftermath, my parents and I were placed in protective custody, given new identities once again. The dark web series was taken down, the viewers and participants tracked and prosecuted. It was over. We were finally free, but the scars remain. I still have nightmares, and every shadow makes me jump. My parents and I are closer now, bound by the shared trauma. We've started therapy, trying to heal and move on. The dark web took a piece of us, but we survived. We're slowly rebuilding our lives day by day. If you're reading this, heed my warning. The internet is vast and full of darkness. Some games are not meant to be played, and some doors should never be opened. Stay safe, stay vigilant, and never let curiosity lead you into the abyss. I ordered alien food of the dark web. The next day, 2 scientists kidnapped me, and the other day, I woke up on the Antarctica in a hidden testing laboratory. So, let me start by saying, I'm not usually the kind of guy who messes around with the dark web, but I was bored one night, scrolling through Reddit, and I stumbled upon this post about alien food. Yeah, I know how it sounds. Crazy, right? The guy posting was all about how it would blow your mind, literally change your life. Curiosity got the better of me. I've always been a thrill seeker, and honestly, I was drunk and feeling adventurous. I went down the rabbit hole and found the site. It looked like any other dodgy dark web page, all black background and neon green text with an alien head logo. They had a list of different alien delicacies. Some of the descriptions were vague, others detailed in ways that made my skin crawl. One caught my eye. Zalaxian slime extract enhances human senses beyond comprehension. It sounded like something out of a sci-fi movie. For 0.5 Bitcoin, it wasn't cheap, but the comments and reviews were oddly convincing. People claimed it did things to them that were indescribable, that it was like touching the edge of the universe. Stupidly, I went for it. I figured, what's the worst that could happen? I could either be scammed out of some crypto or have an unforgettable experience. I put in my address, paid, and waited. The confirmation email was instant, but there was no tracking, no way to know when or if it would arrive. That alone should have been a red flag, but I brushed it off. I didn't even tell my friends about it. I guess a part of me knew it was a bad idea. The next morning, there was a package on my doorstep. No markings, just a plain brown box. I hadn't even heard the delivery. Inside was a small unmarked vial of this thick, greenish-blue liquid. There were no instructions, no warnings, nothing. I was hungover and more than a little nervous, but I'd come this far. I sat down at my kitchen table, staring at this vial for what felt like hours. My curiosity won out, and I twisted off the cap. The smell was indescribable. It was like a mix of ozone, burning plastic, and something sweet. I hesitated, then downed it in one gulp. At first, nothing happened. I sat there feeling stupid, but then, slowly, things started to change. My vision blurred, then sharpened to an almost painful clarity. I could see every speck of dust in the air, every tiny fiber in the fabric of my clothes. Sounds became amplified, my heart beating like a drum in my ears. I felt every hair on my body stand on end, my skin tingling with an electric charge. And then the pain hit. It started as a dull ache in my head, then spread, becoming more intense, like my skull was splitting open. I tried to stand, but my legs gave out, and I collapsed on the floor. My muscles seized up, every nerve in my body on fire. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. I was trapped in my own body, feeling like I was being ripped apart from the inside out. Hours must have passed, but it felt like days. When the pain finally subsided, I was left exhausted, drenched in sweat. I stumbled to my feet, disoriented and shaky. I made it to the bathroom, looking at myself in the mirror. My eyes were bloodshot, my skin pale and clammy. But it wasn't just that. I felt different, like something inside me had changed. That night, I barely slept. My dreams were vivid, filled with strange, otherworldly landscapes and creatures that defied description. I woke up more tired than when I went to bed, my mind buzzing with fragments of those alien visions. The next day, I tried to go about my usual routine, but everything felt off. My senses were still heightened, every sound too loud, every light too bright. I was on edge, paranoid, feeling like I was being watched. It wasn't until the evening that things took a turn for the worse. I was sitting in my living room, trying to watch TV, when I heard a noise outside. It was a faint, scratching sound, like something was clawing at my door. My heart raced as I got up to check, but there was nothing there. I closed the door, double-checking the locks, but the feeling of being watched only intensified. I barely had time to process what was happening before everything went black. The last thing I remember was a sharp pain in my neck and the world fading away. When I woke up, I was in a small, sterile room, strapped to a metal table. The lights were blinding, the air cold and sterile. Panic set in as I struggled against the restraints, but they were too tight. My heart pounded in my chest, every beat echoing in the silence. Two men entered the room, dressed in white lab coats. They looked at me with a mix of curiosity and something else, something colder. One of them spoke, his voice calm and clinical. "Welcome back. You've been out for a while. I tried to ask where I was, who they were, but my throat was dry, and my voice came out as a hoarse whisper. The other man approached, holding a syringe filled with a clear liquid. "Don't worry," he said. "This will help." Before I could protest, he injected it into my arm. Almost instantly, a wave of calm washed over me, dulling the panic. My vision blurred again, and I felt myself slipping back into unconsciousness. The last thing I heard was the first man speaking again, his voice distant and echoing in my mind. "Welcome to Antarctica." When I regained consciousness, I found myself in a different room, larger but no less sterile. The walls were a cold, unforgiving white, and the only light source was a harsh fluorescent overhead. I was no longer strapped down, but I felt just as trapped. The air was frigid, and I could see my breath misting in front of me. I sat up slowly, my head pounding. My body felt weak, like I hadn't moved in days. As I tried to piece together what had happened, the door creaked open, and a woman in a lab coat entered. She had a clipboard and an expression that was all business. "How are you feeling?" she asked, not really expecting an answer. I glared at her. "Where am I? What is this place?" She ignored my questions, jotting something down on her clipboard. "You experienced a significant reaction to the substance. We've been monitoring you closely." "Monitoring me? You kidnapped me." My voice cracked with anger and fear. She looked up, her eyes cold and devoid of empathy. "Your participation is crucial. The effects of the Zalaxian slime extract are unprecedented. We need to understand them." Before I could respond, 2 more men entered the room, the same ones from before. They flanked her, silent and imposing. She nodded to them, and they moved towards me. Panic surged through me again, but my body was still too weak to resist as they hauled me to my feet. They escorted me down a series of dimly lit corridors. The place was a maze, and every turn looked the same. My mind raced with thoughts of escape, but I had no idea where I was or how to get out. Eventually, we arrived at a large steel door. One of the men punched in a code, and the door hissed open. Inside was a room that looked like a twisted version of a hospital operating room. Medical equipment surrounded a single examination table, and the air smelled of antiseptic and something else, something metallic and unpleasant. I was forced onto the table and strapped down again. The woman with the clipboard reappeared, now wearing a mask and gloves. "We're going to conduct a series of tests," she said, her voice muffled by the mask. "You must remain still." The first test was a series of blood draws. They took vial after vial, my arm becoming numb from the repeated jabs of the needle. Then came the scans. MRI, Connecticut, things I didn't even recognize. I was bombarded with lights and sounds, each one more disorienting than the last. As the hours dragged on, my fear turned to a dull, resigned terror. They weren't going to let me go. Whatever they'd given me, whatever was happening to my body, they were intent on studying it to the bitter end. Days passed in a blur of tests and experiments. They rarely spoke to me except to give instructions. My body was subjected to all kinds of invasive procedures, each one more painful and degrading than the last. Sleep was a rare and fitful occurrence, my dreams haunted by those alien landscapes and creatures. One night, or what I assumed was night, time had lost all meaning. I was jolted awake by a loud alarm. The lights flickered, and the door to my room burst open. It was the woman with the clipboard, her mask off, revealing a look of genuine fear for the first time. "Get up," she hissed, unstrapping me with hurried, shaking hands. "We have to move." What's happening? I asked, my voice weak. No time to explain. Just come on. She pulled me to my feet and half dragged me down the corridor. The facility was in chaos. Alarms blared, and people in lab coats ran in every direction. We turned a corner, and I saw one of the men who had escorted me before, lying on the ground, blood pooling around his head. Keep moving, she urged, but my legs felt like lead. We reached another door, this one smaller and less imposing. She fumbled with the keypad, her hands slick with sweat. The door finally clicked open, and she shoved me inside. It was a small storage room, cluttered with boxes and equipment. Stay here, she said. Don't make a sound. She closed the door, leaving me in darkness. I could hear my own ragged breathing, the blood pounding in my ears. Minutes passed, feeling like hours, then I heard footsteps approaching. They were slow, deliberate. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to make myself as small as possible. The door creaked open, and a figure stood silhouetted in the dim light from the corridor. It wasn't one of the scientists. It was something else. Its form was humanoid, but its proportions were all wrong. Its limbs were too long, its head too large. It moved with an unnatural grace, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It stepped into the room, and I saw its skin, gray and slick, like the slime I had ingested. It sniffed the air, turning its head in my direction. I felt a cold dread wash over me as it advanced, its eyes locking onto mine. Then just as it was about to reach me, a loud crash echoed from the corridor. The creature paused, tilting its head as if listening, then turned and slipped out of the room, disappearing into the shadows. I stayed there, frozen, for what felt like an eternity before I dared to move. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't human, and it was loose in the facility. I had to get out. I had to find a way to escape before it found me again. But how? And where would I go? The questions swirled in my mind as I sat there in the darkness, feeling more trapped and terrified than ever. I sat there trembling in the darkness, trying to wrap my head around what I had just seen. The creature's glowing eyes haunted my thoughts, a stark reminder that whatever nightmare I'd stumbled into was far from over. The facility was in chaos, and I knew I had to make my move before it was too late. The sound of distant screams and crashing echoed through the corridors outside. The scientists were clearly dealing with something beyond their control. Maybe, just maybe, I could use the confusion to my advantage. I took a deep breath and peeked out of the storage room. The hallway was deserted, but I could hear footsteps and voices further away. I crept out, staying close to the walls, moving as quietly as possible. My heart was pounding, each step feeling like an eternity. The facility seemed like a labyrinth, and every turn looked the same. Cold, sterile, and unwelcoming. I needed to find an exit, or at least a place to hide until things calmed down. As I rounded a corner, I saw a sign that said exit, with an arrow pointing to the left. My spirits lifted slightly, and I hurried in that direction. But as I approached the door, I heard heavy footsteps and saw shadows moving on the other side. I ducked into a nearby room, praying they hadn't seen me. From my hiding spot, I could hear the scientists talking. Their voices were urgent, panicked. We need to contain it. If it gets out, we're all dead. How did it break free? I thought the restraints were secure. It doesn't matter now. We have to find it before it finds us. I held my breath, waiting for them to move on. Eventually, their voices faded, and I dared to peek out again. The hallway was clear, and I continued towards the exit, more cautious than ever. As I neared another corner, I heard a faint, familiar sound, a soft, wet clicking, like the creature's movements. My stomach churned, and I backed away slowly, praying it wouldn't turn the corner. I found another door and slipped inside, closing it quietly behind me. The room was dimly lit, filled with rows of shelves and medical supplies. I hid behind one of the shelves, my mind racing. I needed a plan, something to get me out of here alive. As I looked around, I noticed a small ventilation shaft near the ceiling. It was a long shot, but it might be my only chance. I stacked some boxes to reach the vent, praying the noise wouldn't attract any unwanted attention. With trembling hands, I pried the cover off and crawled inside. The shaft was cramped and cold, the metal biting into my skin, but it felt safer than the open corridors. I crawled for what felt like miles, every sound amplified in the confined space. Eventually, I found another vent cover and peered through. I saw a room below, larger and more chaotic than the others. It looked like some kind of control center, filled with monitors and equipment. Scientists were running back and forth, their faces masks of fear and desperation. I needed information, something to help me understand what was happening. I carefully pushed the vent cover open and lowered myself into the room, keeping to the shadows. I crept towards a terminal and started reading the screens. What I found made my blood run cold. They were logs detailing their experiments with the Zalaxian slime extract. They had been testing it on human subjects, trying to unlock its potential for heightened senses and cognitive abilities. But things had gone horribly wrong. The extract didn't just enhance human senses, it transformed them, creating something monstrous. The creature I'd seen was once a human test subject, twisted and mutated by the extract, and now it was loose, hunting through the facility. Suddenly, a hand clamped down on my shoulder. I spun around, ready to fight, but it was the woman with the clipboard. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. "You have to help me," she whispered urgently. "We need to stop it." "Stop it? How?" "We need to get out of here." She shook her head. "If it escapes, there's no telling what it will do. We have to destroy it. Follow me." Reluctantly, I followed her through the chaos, trying to avoid the other scientists. She led me to a secure room filled with weapons and equipment. She handed me a gun, her hands trembling. "This is our only chance," she said. "We lure it here and contain it. Then we destroy it." Before I could respond, a deafening crash echoed through the facility. The creature was close, its wet, clicking footsteps growing louder. The woman grabbed my arm and pulled me towards another door, leading to a dark, narrow corridor. We moved quickly, the sound of the creature's pursuit driving us forward. The corridor led to a large, empty room with a single flickering light overhead. She positioned me near the entrance and took up a spot on the opposite side. "Get ready," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. The door burst open, and the creature stepped into the room, its glowing eyes scanning the darkness. It moved with eerie, predatory grace, its gaze locking onto me. I raised the gun, my hands shaking, and fired. The bullet seemed to have little effect, barely slowing it down. The woman screamed at me to keep shooting, but the creature was already too close. It lunged at me, and I felt its cold, slimy hands wrap around my throat. lifting me off the ground. As I struggled, the woman grabbed a nearby metal rod and swung it with all her might, hitting the creature in the head. It roared in pain, dropping me to the floor. I gasped for breath, scrambling away as she continued to attack it. Finally, with one last desperate swing, she drove the rod through its chest. The creature let out a horrific guttural scream, its body convulsing violently. Then it collapsed, twitching, and lay still. We stood there, panting and shaking, covered in sweat and blood. The woman dropped the rod and sank to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "It's over," she whispered. "It's finally over." But as I looked at the creature's lifeless body, I couldn't shake the feeling that our nightmare was far from finished. The facility was still in chaos, and there was no guarantee that another experiment hadn't gone wrong. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice hoarse. "Now." She nodded, and we made our way back through the corridors, avoiding the panicked scientists. We found an emergency exit and stumbled out into the freezing Antarctic night. The cold bit into our skin, but it felt liberating compared to the sterile, suffocating air of the facility. We trudged through the snow, desperate to put as much distance between us and the nightmare we'd escaped. As we moved further away, the sounds of chaos faded, replaced by the eerie silence of the frozen wasteland. Eventually, we found a small outpost, deserted but still operational. We managed to send a distress signal, hoping someone would find us before the elements claimed us. As we waited, huddled together for warmth, I couldn't help but think about the horrors we'd left behind. The Zalaxian slime extract, the creature, the twisted experiments. It was all too much to process. But one thing was certain: I would never, ever let my curiosity lead me down such a dark path again. The outpost was a grim, decrepit structure, barely visible against the blinding white of the Antarctic landscape. It looked abandoned, but we had no choice. The cold was relentless, and we needed shelter. The woman, whose name I learned was Dr. Elise Warren, managed to get the door open. Inside, it was slightly warmer, but the air was stale, and the place had a long-neglected feel. Dust-covered equipment and empty supply crates were scattered around, and the only light came from a flickering overhead bulb. "We need to find a radio," Elise said, her breath visible in the frigid air. "There has to be a way to call for help." We split up, searching through the rooms. The outpost was small, but it felt like a maze. Each room was a grim reminder of how isolated we were. In one, I found a bunk room with old, mildew-covered mattresses. In another, a kitchen with rusted appliances and ancient, unopened cans of food. Finally, in what appeared to be the main control room, Elise found an old, crackling radio. She fiddled with the dials, trying to find a signal. Static filled the room, interspersed with faint, distant voices. "Mayday, Mayday," she said into the receiver. "This is Dr. Elise Warren, requesting immediate evacuation from Antarctic coordinates 82.8628 degrees S, 135.0000 degrees W. Repeat, Mayday." We waited, holding our breath. The static persisted for what felt like an eternity. Then a voice broke through. "Copy that, Dr. Warren. This is McMurdo Station. We read you. Evacuation team en route. Hold tight." Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. Elise and I both knew we weren't out of the woods yet. We had no idea how long the evacuation team would take, and the outpost felt anything but safe. The howling wind outside only added to the eerie atmosphere, a constant reminder of the inhospitable environment. As we settled in, trying to make the best of our situation, I noticed a door at the back of the outpost, slightly ajar. Curiosity, despite everything, got the better of me. I pushed it open and found a set of stairs leading down into the darkness. "Elise," I called out. "There's a basement." She joined me, flashlight in hand, and we descended cautiously. The air grew colder and damper as we went down. At the bottom, we found a room that was different from the others. This one was clearly used more recently. There were rows of filing cabinets and shelves filled with old documents and equipment. In the center of the room was a table covered in notes and maps. Elise picked up one of the notebooks, her eyes widening as she read. This is a research outpost," she said. "They were studying something down here." "What do you mean?" I asked, peering over her shoulder. She showed me the notes, filled with detailed observations and sketches. They found something buried in the ice, an organism. It matches the descriptions of the Silaxian slime. They were experimenting on it, trying to unlock its secrets. A chill ran down my spine, and it wasn't just from the cold. "You mean they knew about this stuff? How dangerous it was?" Elise nodded, her expression grim. "It looks like they tried to weaponize it, use it for their own purposes, but something went wrong. They couldn't control it." As we sifted through the documents, it became clear that the outpost was a front for a clandestine research project. They'd been testing the organism on human subjects, much like what had been done to me. The notes detailed horrific transformations, failed containment procedures, and ultimately the decision to abandon the project. "They left it here," Elise whispered. "They left it to die." Just then, we heard a noise from above, a soft, wet clicking sound, unmistakably familiar. Our eyes met, and we knew immediately the creature was here. We rushed back upstairs, only to find the outpost door ajar, the wind howling through the gap. Snow was already blowing in, covering the floor. The creature's tracks were visible, leading from the door into the outpost. "It's hunting us," I said, panic rising in my chest. "We need to find a way to defend ourselves." Elise grabbed a heavy wrench from a nearby toolbox, and I armed myself with a large knife from the kitchen. We moved cautiously, trying to track the creature's movements. The flickering light cast eerie shadows, making every corner seem more menacing. As we searched, the power suddenly went out, plunging us into darkness. The only light now came from our flashlights, the beams piercing through the blackness. The temperature dropped even further, and I could see my breath in the dim light. We heard a crash from the control room, followed by a low, guttural growl. My heart pounded as we approached, our weapons ready. The creature was there, tearing through the equipment, its glowing eyes reflecting in the beam of my flashlight. It turned towards us, its gaze locking onto mine. I could see the twisted remnants of its human features, now grotesquely distorted. It let out a roar and charged. Elise swung the wrench, hitting it in the side, but it barely flinched. I slashed with the knife, aiming for its eyes, but it was too fast. It knocked me to the ground, and I felt its cold, slimy hands close around my throat. I struggled, gasping for breath, but it was incredibly strong. Just as I felt myself slipping into unconsciousness, Elise managed to drive the wrench into its skull with a sickening crunch. The creature let out a final, agonized scream and collapsed on top of me. Gasping for air, I pushed the lifeless body off and stumbled to my feet. Elise was panting, covered in blood and sweat, but alive. "We did it," she said, her voice shaky. "We killed it." But as I looked around the ruined control room, I couldn't shake the feeling that our ordeal wasn't over. The documents we had found suggested there were more of these creatures, buried deep in the ice, waiting to be discovered. "We need to leave," I said. "Now." We gathered what supplies we could and made our way back to the entrance. The snowstorm had intensified, and visibility was near zero. We huddled together, bracing against the wind, hoping the evacuation team would find us soon. Hours passed, and our hope began to wane. Just as we were about to give up, we saw lights cutting through the storm. A helicopter, its searchlight sweeping the area, landed nearby. We stumbled towards it, waving frantically. The door opened, and a man in a heavy parka helped us inside. "You're safe now," he said. "We'll get you out of here." As the helicopter lifted off, I looked down at the outpost, now barely visible in the storm. I couldn't help but wonder what other horrors lay hidden beneath the ice, waiting to be unleashed. And I knew one thing for certain. I would never forget the nightmare that began with a single reckless decision. The helicopter ride back to civilization was a blur of exhaustion and cold. Elise and I huddled together under thick blankets, shivering despite the heater blasting inside the cabin. The pilot didn't ask many questions, just gave us the occasional glance filled with a mix of curiosity and concern. We landed at McMurdo Station, where a team of medics and officials were waiting for us. They whisked us away into a secure building where we were stripped of our frozen clothes and bundled into warm, dry ones. We were separated for debriefing, each of us placed in small, brightly lit rooms. The questions came fast and relentless. I recounted everything, ordering the vial, the experiments, the creature, our escape. They listened intently, taking notes, occasionally exchanging glances that suggested they knew more than they were letting on. After hours of questioning, they finally left me alone. I sat there, staring at the walls, replaying the horrors over and over in my mind. I was haunted by the images of the creature, the cold, sterile facility, and the dark secrets hidden beneath the ice. Days passed in a daze. They kept us isolated, running tests to ensure we weren't carrying any biological contaminants. I barely saw Elise, only catching glimpses of her as we were moved from one secure room to another. The station's personnel were polite but distant, their eyes full of suspicion and fear. Eventually, they declared us clear and allowed us to leave the station. We were given civilian clothes and flown to a small airport in Chile. There, we were put on a commercial flight back to the United States. The whole process felt surreal, like waking up from a nightmare that clung to your skin. Back home, things didn't get easier. I struggled with nightmares, the vivid dreams of alien landscapes and grotesque creatures. Sleep was a rare and fleeting respite. My nights filled with sweat-drenched sheets and silent screams. Elise and I kept in touch, trying to make sense of what had happened to us. We met a few times, discussing our experiences, but it only seemed to deepen the sense of unease. We both knew that the people who had debriefed us were keeping tabs on us, watching our every move. One night, as I lay in bed, my phone buzzed with a text from Elise. "I found something. Meet me at the park. Now." I dressed quickly and hurried out, the cool night air a sharp contrast to the warmth of my apartment. The park was deserted, the only light coming from the dim street lamps casting long shadows. Elise was waiting at our usual spot, her face pale and drawn. She held up a flash drive. "I hacked into their system," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I found files, documents they didn't show us. There's more to this than we thought." We moved to a nearby bench, and she plugged the flash drive into a laptop. The screen filled with files, labeled with cryptic names and dates. She opened one, and my heart sank as I saw images and notes detailing more experiments, more creatures, and something even worse, a plan. "They're continuing the research," she said, her voice trembling. "They're planning to use this Salaxian slime for military applications, creating weapons and soldiers. They don't care about the risks." The implications hit me like a punch to the gut. They were willing to unleash these horrors on the world, regardless of the consequences, and we were the only ones who knew the full extent of the danger. "We have to expose them," I said, my voice firm, despite the fear gnawing at my insides. "We can't let them get away with this." Elise nodded, her determination mirroring my own. "But we have to be careful. They're watching us. One wrong move, and we disappear." Over the next few weeks, we gathered evidence, using every bit of our technical skills to uncover the truth. We created backups, encrypted files, and planned our next steps meticulously. We reached out to journalists, scientists, anyone who might listen. The night we decided to go public, my apartment was broken into. I came home to find the place ransacked, my computer and notes missing. Panic set in, but I managed to grab my emergency stash, a hidden drive with all the critical files, and fled to Elise's place. When I arrived, her door was ajar. I pushed it open slowly, my heart racing. The place was eerily silent. I found her in her office, slumped over her desk. My breath caught in my throat as I approached, fearing the worst. But she was alive. Barely. She had been drugged, a syringe still on the floor. I shook her gently, and she groaned, her eyes fluttering open. "We have to go," I whispered urgently. "They know." With great effort, we gathered what we could and fled into the night. We made our way to a safe house, a small cabin owned by an old friend of Elise's. There we hunkered down, waiting for the storm to pass. Days turned into weeks, and the fear of being found gnawed at us constantly. But we managed to get our story out, sending files to journalists and uploading videos to every platform we could. The response was immediate and explosive. The media picked up the story, and soon investigations were launched. There was public outcry, demands for answers. The pressure mounted on the organization behind the experiments, forcing them into the spotlight. Elise and I remained in hiding, knowing that we were still targets, but we felt a sense of grim satisfaction, knowing that the truth was out there, that the horrors we had endured were not in vain. As the months passed, we slowly began to rebuild our lives, haunted but hopeful. The world had changed, and so had we. The nightmares still came, but we faced them together, knowing that we had done everything we could to stop the madness. And though we were scarred, we were survivors. We had faced the unknown, stared into the abyss, and lived to tell the tale. The horrors of the dark web, the alien food, the hidden laboratory in Antarctica. They were all part of a past we could never forget, but could now, finally, begin to move beyond. I saw strange light in the sky going for a few days. The next day, when I explained the situation on a dark web forum, 2 men knocked on my door. "So, I've been sitting on this for a while now," and I honestly don't know if I should even be posting this. But I need to get it out there because I'm seriously freaked out, and maybe someone here will believe me or have some answers. I swear, this is 100% true, and I wouldn't be sharing this if it wasn't. So, here goes. About 2 weeks ago, I was out on my back porch smoking a cigarette. It was around midnight, and I live in a pretty rural area, so it's usually dead quiet at night. I remember it was particularly cold that night because I was shivering and thinking about just going inside. That's when I saw it, a light in the sky. At first, I thought it was just a plane or a satellite, but it wasn't moving like either of those. It was just hovering there, flickering slightly. I kept watching it, thinking maybe it was a drone, but it was way too high up for that. And then it started to move, slowly at first, like it was drifting, but then it shot across the sky at an impossible speed and stopped abruptly. I'm talking about going from one side of the horizon to the other in less than a second. I almost dropped my cigarette in shock. I stayed outside for another hour, just staring up at the sky, but it didn't come back. I went inside, feeling uneasy but convinced I had just seen something explainable, maybe a military exercise or something. I didn't sleep well that night. The next night, the same thing happened. I saw the light again, in almost the exact same spot. This time, I grabbed my phone and tried to record it, but my camera wouldn't pick it up. It was like the light was too dim or too far away, but I swear it was there. It did the same weird movements, hovering, then darting around the sky. By the third night, I was starting to get seriously freaked out. I told my friend James about it, and he laughed it off, saying I was probably just seeing things, or it was some kind of optical illusion. But I knew what I saw. That night, I decided to stay up all night and keep an eye out. I was determined to figure out what was going on. Sure enough, around midnight, the light appeared again. This time, it was closer, and I could see it more clearly. It wasn't just a light. There was something else, like a shadow or a dark mass behind the light, moving with it. I felt this overwhelming sense of dread, like I was being watched. I didn't sleep at all that night. I stayed on my porch until sunrise, but the light didn't come back after that initial sighting. I decided I needed answers, so I did something really stupid. I went on the dark web. I found this forum where people talked about UFOs and government conspiracies. I posted about what I had seen, describing the lights and the weird movements. I asked if anyone else had experienced anything similar or knew what it could be. Within minutes, I got a reply. Someone with the username Watcher42 told me to delete my post immediately and to stop looking into it. They said I was in danger and that they were watching. I should have listened, but I didn't. Instead, I messaged Watcher42 privately, asking what they meant. They responded with a single sentence: "They will come for you." I asked who they were, but I didn't get a response. The next day, I went to work, trying to shake off the creepy feeling. But when I got home, there were two men standing outside my house. They were dressed in black suits, looking like something straight out of a Men in Black movie. My heart sank. I knew this wasn't a coincidence. One of them stepped forward and called me by name. He said they needed to talk to me about my recent online activity. I was shaking, but I invited them in, hoping to get some answers. They asked me about the lights, what I had seen, and who I had told. I tried to play dumb, but they weren't buying it. Then they started threatening me. They said if I didn't stop asking questions, bad things would happen. They knew things about me, personal things. They mentioned my job, my family, even things I hadn't told anyone. I felt like I was suffocating. I asked them who they were, but they just gave me this cold, empty stare. One of them handed me a card and told me to call the number if I saw the lights again. Then they left, just like that. I watched them get into a black car and drive away, leaving me feeling more terrified than ever. I haven't seen the lights since that night, but I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. Every time I go outside, I feel like someone's eyes are on me. I don't know who those men were or what they wanted, but I'm scared. I don't know what to do. Has anyone else experienced something like this? What should I do? I'm really freaking out here. After the men left, I was too freaked out to stay at home. I called James, practically begging him to let me crash at his place for a few nights. I didn't tell him everything, just that I had some weirdo show up at my door, and I didn't feel safe. He reluctantly agreed, probably thinking I was being paranoid. The first night at James's was uneventful. We played some video games, drank a few beers, and I crashed on his couch. I kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see those men peering in, but nothing happened. The next day, I went to work as usual, trying to keep my mind off things. When I got back to James's that evening, he had this weird look on his face. He told me a guy had called his phone asking for me, said it was urgent. My blood ran cold. I hadn't given anyone James's number. I asked if he got a name, but James said the guy hung up before he could ask. I told him to ignore any more calls like that. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying everything in my mind. The lights, the men in black, the phone call. I felt like I was in some kind of nightmare. Around 2 a.m., I got up to get a glass of water. James's place was eerily quiet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As I walked back to the living room, I noticed a faint glow coming from outside. My heart started pounding. I peeked through the blinds, and there it was, the light, hovering in the sky, closer than ever before. I felt that same sense of dread wash over me. I grabbed my phone and started recording, but like before, the camera couldn't pick it up. It was like the light didn't want to be seen. Then I heard a noise behind me. I turned around to see James standing there, looking half asleep and annoyed. "What the hell are you doing?" he asked. I pointed to the window, trying to explain, but when he looked, the light was gone. He just shook his head and went back to bed, muttering something about me losing it. I sat on the couch, staring at my phone, wondering what to do. That's when I remembered the card the men had given me. I pulled it out of my wallet and stared at the number. I didn't want to call it, but I felt like I had no choice. My hands were shaking as I dialed. It rang twice before someone picked up. "You've seen the light again," a voice said. It wasn't a question. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. "That's not important," the voice replied. "What's important is that you listen carefully. You need to stop asking questions and stop trying to document what you're seeing. It's for your own safety." "Why?" I demanded. "What is that light? Who are you people?" There was a long pause, and I thought they had hung up. But then the voice spoke again, colder and more menacing than before. "You don't want to know. Trust me. Forget about the light and you'll be fine. Keep digging and you won't like what you find." The line went dead. I sat there staring at my phone, feeling a mix of fear and anger. I wasn't going to let them scare me into silence. The next day, I went back on the dark web forum using a new account. I posted a detailed description of everything that had happened, including the men who visited me and the phone call. I asked if anyone else had experienced something similar. The responses I got were a mix of supportive and skeptical, but one stood out. A user named TruthSeeker88 sent me a private message claiming they had seen the light too and had also been visited by strange men. They warned me to be careful and suggested we meet in person to share information. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop in a nearby town the following evening. I didn't tell James where I was going. I didn't want him to worry or try to stop me. When I arrived at the coffee shop, I spotted TruthSeeker88 right away. He was a tall, thin guy with a nervous energy about him. We got our drinks and sat in a quiet corner, away from prying eyes. He told me his story, which was eerily similar to mine. He had seen the light, been visited by men in black, and received threatening phone calls, but he had dug deeper, and what he found was terrifying. He showed me printouts of documents and photos, all pointing to some kind of government cover-up involving extraterrestrial technology. As he spoke, I noticed two men enter the coffee shop, dressed in black suits. My heart started racing. I whispered to TruthSeeker88 that we needed to leave, but it was too late. The men were already approaching our table. They grabbed us, one on each arm, and dragged us out the back door. No one in the coffee shop even seemed to notice. Outside, they shoved us into a black van and blindfolded us. I don't know how long we drove, but it felt like hours. When the van finally stopped, they pulled us out and removed the blindfolds. We were in some kind of underground facility with harsh fluorescent lights and sterile white walls. They separated us, and I was taken to a small room with a single chair and a table. A man in a lab coat entered and sat down across from me. "Tell me everything you know," he said, his voice cold and detached. I told him about the lights, the men who visited me, the phone calls, and the meeting with TruthSeeker88. He listened, taking notes, and occasionally asking questions. When I was done, he leaned back in his chair and studied me for a moment. "You should have listened to the warnings," he said. "Now you're in too deep." Before I could respond, he stood up and left the room. I was left alone, feeling more terrified and helpless than ever. I don't know what they're going to do to me or TruthSeeker88. I don't even know where I am. All I know is that I shouldn't have ignored the warnings. If you're reading this, please, be careful. Don't make the same mistakes I did. They're watching, and they will come for you if you get too close to the truth. I don't know how long I was left alone in that room. Hours felt like days. The fluorescent lights buzzed incessantly, and the sterile smell of the place made me nauseous. Every sound echoed through the empty halls, amplifying my fear. My mind raced with thoughts of what they might do to me, but I couldn't come up with any answers. Eventually, the door creaked open, and a different man walked in. This one was older, with graying hair, and a calm demeanor that somehow made him even more terrifying. He sat down across from me, adjusting his glasses as he looked through a file. "Do you know why you're here?" he asked, his voice almost too soft to hear. I shook my head, unable to find my voice. "You've stumbled onto something you shouldn't have," he continued. "But you're not the first, and you won't be the last. The question is, What are we going to do with you? Before I could respond, he leaned in closer. You saw the lights. You spoke to others. You posted online. And now, you're a problem that needs to be dealt with. A wave of panic washed over me. Please, I stammered. I just want to go home. I won't tell anyone. I'll delete everything. He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. It's not that simple. Once you've seen, you can't unsee. And once you know, you can't unknow. He stood up and motioned to someone outside the room. 2 guards entered and pulled me to my feet. You're coming with us, one of them said, gripping my arm tightly. They led me down a long corridor, past rows of doors that all looked the same. I wondered how many other people were trapped here, people like me who had seen too much. We stopped in front of a heavy metal door, and one of the guards unlocked it. Inside was a small windowless cell with a cot and a metal toilet. You'll stay here until we decide what to do with you, the older man said. Think about what you've done, and maybe we'll find a way to resolve this without complications. The door slammed shut behind me, and I was plunged into darkness. I felt my way to the cot and sat down, my mind racing. How had it come to this? I had only wanted to understand what I'd seen, to find some answers. But now, I was a prisoner, held by people who seemed to have no limits to their reach. Hours passed, or maybe it was days. I couldn't tell. The only light came from a small dim bulb in the ceiling, and the only sounds were my own breathing and the occasional footsteps outside my cell. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw those lights in the sky, moving erratically, haunting me. One day, the door to my cell opened again. This time, it was the first man, the one in the lab coat. He had a tray of food with him, and he set it down on the floor. You need to eat, he said. We can't have you getting sick on us. I eyed the tray suspiciously, but hunger got the better of me. I picked at the food, bland and tasteless, but it was enough to keep me going. The man watched me eat, his expression unreadable. What do you want from me? I asked, my voice cracking from disuse. He sighed. We want you to forget, to move on with your life and leave all of this behind. But you've made it difficult by digging too deep. Just tell me what the lights are, I pleaded. Why are you so desperate to keep it a secret? He looked at me for a long moment, as if weighing whether to tell me the truth. Finally, he spoke. The lights are not of this world. They are something we cannot fully understand, but we know they pose a threat. Our job is to keep people safe, to prevent mass panic. If everyone knew the truth, it would cause chaos. But why threaten me? Why not just explain? Because people like you never stop asking questions, and questions lead to more questions, and eventually to answers that the world isn't ready for. He stood up to leave, but I called after him. What happened to Truth Seeker 88? Is he here? The man paused at the door, then turned to face me. He's safe for now, but he's in the same position as you. You both need to let this go, for your own sake. The door closed again, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I felt a mixture of relief and dread. At least Truth Seeker 88 was alive, but who knew for how long? I had to find a way out of here, to warn him, to figure out what to do next. Days blurred together in that cell. I tried to keep track of time, but it was impossible. My only contact with the outside world was the occasional visit from the man in the lab coat, bringing food and asking if I was ready to forget. Each time I told him the same thing. I wanted to go home. One night, I was awakened by the sound of my cell door creaking open. 2 guards stood there, motioning for me to follow. I had no idea what time it was, but I knew this wasn't a routine visit. They led me down a different corridor this time, deeper into the facility. We stopped in front of another door, and one of the guards unlocked it. Inside was a room filled with monitors, each displaying different parts of the facility. And there, in the corner, was Truth Seeker 88, huddled in a chair, looking just as disheveled as I felt. They shoved me inside and locked the door behind me. Truth Seeker 88 looked up, his eyes wide with fear and relief. "You're here," he whispered. "I thought they had gotten rid of you." "Not yet," I replied, "but I don't know how much longer we have." We spent the next few hours comparing notes, trying to piece together what we knew. The lights, the men in black, the underground facility, it all pointed to something bigger than we had imagined, but we couldn't figure out what to do next. We were trapped with no way out and no way to get the truth to the outside world. As we talked, I noticed one of the monitors flickering. It showed an empty hallway, but the image kept distorting, like something was interfering with the signal. I pointed it out to Truthseeker 88, and he frowned. "That's strange. I've never seen that happen before." We watched the monitor, hoping it would give us some kind of clue. After a few minutes, the distortion cleared, and we saw a figure standing in the hallway. It was a woman, dressed in a white lab coat, looking directly at the camera. She held up a piece of paper with a single word written on it: "Run." Before we could react, the door to our room burst open, and the guards stormed in. They grabbed us, shouting orders, but in the chaos, I saw the woman from the monitor standing in the doorway. She motioned for us to follow her, and for a moment I hesitated, but something in her eyes told me to trust her. We broke free from the guards and ran after the woman, down a series of twisting corridors. Alarms blared, and red lights flashed, but we kept running, adrenaline propelling us forward. She led us to a service elevator and pressed the button for the surface. As the elevator doors closed, she turned to us. "My name is Dr. Lawson. I've been working here for years, but I can't stand by and watch innocent people suffer anymore. You need to get out of here and tell the world what's happening." The elevator ride felt like an eternity, but finally, the doors opened, and we found ourselves in a dimly lit parking garage. Dr. Lawson handed us a set of keys. "There's a car parked outside. It'll take you to safety. Don't stop, and don't look back." We thanked her and ran to the car, hearts pounding. As we sped away from the facility, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw Dr. Lawson watching us, a look of determination on her face. We drove for hours, not speaking, just trying to put as much distance between us and that place as possible. Eventually, we found a motel and checked in under fake names. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Now, we're in hiding, trying to figure out our next move. We need to get the truth out there, but we have to be careful. They're still watching, and they won't stop until they silence us for good. If you're reading this, please, be careful. We don't know who to trust, but we can't do this alone. The truth is out there, and it's up to us to find it. The motel room was shabby, but it felt like a sanctuary after the nightmare we'd escaped. Truthseeker 88, who introduced himself as Alex, and I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to catch our breath and process everything. We had managed to get a few hours of restless sleep, but the fear of being found kept us both on edge. We decided we needed to gather more information before making our next move. Alex suggested using public libraries to access the internet safely, avoiding the same mistake that got us into this mess. We couldn't risk using our phones or personal devices, knowing they were likely compromised. The next morning, we split up, each going to a different library. We agreed to meet back at the motel by dusk. I spent the day combing through conspiracy forums, news archives, and anything that might give us a clue about the lights or the men in black. I found a few scattered reports of similar sightings, but nothing concrete. It was frustrating and terrifying to realize how little information there was. Back at the motel, Alex had more luck. He found references to an old military project called Project Sentinel, which supposedly involved experimental technology capable of creating light anomalies in the sky. According to the rumors, the project had been shut down decades ago, but there were whispers that it had been revived under a new name. We were deep in discussion when there was a knock on the door. My heart nearly stopped. We froze, exchanging terrified looks. No one should know we were here. "Who is it?" Alex called out, trying to keep his voice steady. "It's me, Dr. Lawson," came the whispered reply. I rushed to the door and peered through the peephole. Sure enough, it was Dr. Lawson, looking anxious and out of breath. I let her in quickly, and she closed the door behind her, locking it. "You're not safe here," she said, her voice urgent. "They know you escaped, and they're looking for you." "What do we do?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. "I've arranged for a safe house," she replied. "It's not far from here. We need to leave immediately." We gathered our things in silence, the gravity of the situation sinking in. Dr. Lawson led us to a beat-up old sedan parked around the corner. We piled in, and she drove us through a maze of back roads and alleys, doing her best to avoid being followed. The safe house was a small, dilapidated cabin deep in the woods. It looked abandoned, but once we were inside, Dr. Lawson revealed a hidden basement filled with supplies and equipment. It was clear she had been planning this for a while. "We'll be safe here for a few days," she said, locking the door behind us. "But we need to figure out our next steps." We spent the next few hours going over everything we knew. Dr. Lawson explained that she had been working on Project Sentinel for years, but had grown disillusioned with the secrecy and the lengths the organization would go to protect their experiments. She confirmed that the lights we had seen were indeed part of the project, extraterrestrial technology that had been reverse engineered by the government. "They're trying to harness the power of these lights," she explained, "but they don't fully understand it. The technology is unstable, and they're risking everything by continuing their experiments." "Why not just expose them?" Alex asked. "Go to the media. Tell the world what's happening." "It's not that simple," Dr. Lawson replied. "They control the narrative. Any attempt to expose them will be discredited or silenced. We need undeniable proof." That night, as we huddled in the basement, we made a plan. We would return to the facility, find concrete evidence of Project Sentinel, and expose it to the world. It was dangerous, but it was the only way to stop them. The following day, we prepared for our mission. Dr. Lawson had managed to procure some basic disguises and fake IDs. She also had a map of the facility and a rough schedule of the guards' shifts. We would have one shot at this, and we couldn't afford any mistakes. As night fell, we set out for the facility. My heart pounded with every step, the fear of being caught almost overwhelming, but the thought of those lights and the men who had threatened us kept me moving forward. We reached the facility's perimeter without incident. Dr. Lawson led us to a maintenance entrance where we managed to bypass the security system. Once inside, we moved quickly but cautiously, avoiding the patrols and cameras as best we could. Our goal was the central lab, where the experiments were conducted and the records were kept. We had just reached the door when we heard footsteps approaching. We ducked into a nearby storage room, holding our breath as a group of guards walked past. "Almost there," Dr. Lawson whispered once the coast was clear. "Stay close." We entered the lab, and my breath caught in my throat. The room was filled with strange, otherworldly equipment, glowing with an eerie light. In the center was a large, cylindrical chamber, pulsating with energy. "This is it," Dr. Lawson said, moving to a computer terminal. "I'll download the data. You two keep watch." As she worked, Alex and I kept an eye on the door, the tension almost unbearable. Minutes felt like hours, but finally, Dr. Lawson nodded. "Got it," she said, holding up a flash drive. "Let's go." We retraced our steps, nerves frayed with every corner we turned. We were almost at the exit when an alarm blared. Red lights flashed, and the facility went into lockdown. "Run!" Dr. Lawson shouted. We sprinted down the hall, the sound of guards closing in behind us. We burst through the maintenance door and into the night, the cold air hitting us like a wall. Dr. Lawson led us to a hidden trail through the woods, and we ran until our lungs burned. We finally reached the car and piled in, Dr. Lawson gunning the engine. We sped away, the facility disappearing behind us. We didn't stop until we were miles away, the adrenaline slowly fading. Back at the safe house, we finally allowed ourselves to breathe. Dr. Lawson began transferring the data from the flash drive to a secure server. We had the proof, but the fight was far from over. As we watched the progress bar slowly fill, a sense of dread settled over me. We had come this far, but the real challenge was just beginning. Exposing Project Sentinel would put us in even greater danger, but it was the only way to stop them. "We did it," Alex said, his voice shaky but hopeful. "Yeah," I replied, trying to muster a smile. We did, but deep down I knew the hardest part was still ahead. And as I looked at Dr. Lawson, I saw the same fear and determination in her eyes. We had uncovered the truth, but now we had to survive long enough to share it with the world. The next few days were a blur of tension and fear. We knew that the moment we went public with the information, our lives would be at risk. Dr. Lawson set up a secure communication line with a trusted journalist she knew, someone who had a history of exposing government cover-ups. His name was David, and he had a reputation for digging deep and not backing down. David agreed to meet us in a secluded location outside of town. We chose an abandoned warehouse, far from prying eyes. The drive there was nerve-wracking. Every car that passed us felt like a potential threat. We kept a close watch on our surroundings, ready to make a run for it at any sign of trouble. When we arrived at the warehouse, David was already there, setting up his equipment. He was a middle-aged man with a grizzled beard and a no-nonsense attitude. He didn't waste any time with pleasantries. "Let's get this on record," he said, his voice steady and calm. "I need to know everything." We spent the next few hours recounting our story, starting from the moment I first saw the lights. Dr. Lawson provided the technical details, explaining the experiments and the dangers of the technology. Alex and I filled in the gaps, describing our encounters with the men in black and our escape from the facility. David listened intently, taking notes and recording everything. When we handed him the flash drive, he plugged it into his laptop and began reviewing the data. His eyes widened as he scrolled through the files. "This is big," he said, looking up at us. "But we need more than just data. We need proof of the human cost, the people who've been silenced or disappeared." Dr. Lawson nodded. "There's a list of names in those files, people who worked on the project and vanished. If we can find even one of them, it'll strengthen our case." We knew we were running out of time. The organization behind Project Sentinel wouldn't sit idle for long. We had to move quickly and carefully. David made arrangements for us to lay low in a series of safe houses while he followed up on the leads. The first few days were agonizing. We stayed hidden, constantly on edge, waiting for any sign of trouble. David sent us updates, but progress was slow. He was hitting dead ends and roadblocks at every turn. Then one night, the safe house was breached. We were jolted awake by the sound of glass shattering and heavy footsteps. Dr. Lawson screamed as the door was kicked in, and armed men stormed into the room. "Go!" Alex shouted, grabbing my arm and pulling me towards the back door. We scrambled outside into the freezing night, with no time to think. We just ran, the sound of gunshots echoing behind us. We sprinted through the woods, branches tearing at our clothes and faces. I could hear the men chasing us, shouting orders, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. We were outnumbered and outgunned, but we had to keep moving. We reached a clearing and saw a small cabin in the distance. It looked abandoned, but it was our only hope. We bolted towards it, our lungs burning with every breath. We burst through the door and barricaded it with whatever we could find. "Upstairs," Dr. Lawson panted, pointing to a narrow staircase. We hurried up, finding a small attic with a single window. From there, we could see the men closing in on the cabin. "This is it," Alex said, his voice filled with resignation. "We're trapped." Dr. Lawson was frantically searching through her bag. "There's one last thing we can do," she said, pulling out a small device. "It's a signal jammer. It won't hold them off for long, but it might buy us enough time to send a final message." We set up the jammer and watched as the men outside began to scramble, their communication devices failing. It was a small victory, but we knew it wouldn't last. Dr. Lawson quickly typed out a message on her laptop, sending it to David and a few other trusted contacts. "They'll know we didn't make it," she said, tears in her eyes, "but they'll have the proof. It's up to them now." The men outside started to regroup, finding ways around the jammer. We could hear them breaking down the door, their footsteps echoing through the cabin. We huddled together, knowing the end was near. "I'm sorry," I whispered, feeling a mix of fear and regret. "I should have never looked into those lights." "It's not your fault," Alex replied, squeezing my hand. "We did what we had to do." The door to the attic burst open, and the men flooded in, their guns trained on us. I closed my eyes, waiting for the inevitable. But then, a deafening roar filled the air, followed by an explosion. The cabin shook, and the men shouted in confusion. I opened my eyes to see flames engulfing the room, the heat searing my skin. "We have to go, now!" Dr. Lawson screamed, pulling us towards the window. We climbed out onto the roof, the fire spreading rapidly. There was no time to think, no time to plan. We jumped, landing hard on the ground below. We ran, not looking back, not stopping until we were far from the burning cabin. The night sky was lit up with the glow of the fire, and the sound of sirens filled the air. We kept running, disappearing into the darkness, knowing we were still being hunted, but we had one thing on our side, the truth. And as long as we kept moving, kept fighting, there was still hope. This is not the end. We will find a way to expose Project Sentinel and bring those responsible to justice. We will keep running, keep hiding, and keep fighting until the truth is known. If you're reading this, know that we are out there, and we need your help. Share our story, spread the word, and join us in the fight against the darkness. The truth is out there, and it's up to us to uncover it.